Alright, this is my presentation on the CSI bias and its correlation to the verdict. So according to the Baldani Law Group, around 2.3 million people in the United States are in the federal prison system, and about 5% of those people are wrongfully convicted. This means that about 12,000 people in our prison systems are there for the wrong reasons. They also say that of 195,000 convictions every year, around 975 of those are wrongful convictions. As seen on this graph here, incorrect forensics is responsible for about 47% of all wrongful convictions. When people think of forensic evidence, they think of fingerprints or DNA because television shows have sensationalized the use of these types of evidence. More often than not, DNA is seen as more infallible than fingerprint evidence. However, neither of these types are actually infallible. In a study conducted by Lisa Smith and Ray Bull at the University of Leicester, they used a group of their psychology students to study the effect of a pre-trial bias in jury members. They had previously constructed a fictional court case in another study and decided to use this trial in this study. They had the students read the case thoroughly and then had them act as a mock jury. They constructed the forensic evidence evaluation bias scale and used a principal component analysis to find that two kinds of biases existed within a jury. They found that there was the existence of either a pro-prosecution bias or a pro-defense bias. They found that those of the pro-prosecution bias tended to lean heavily on forensic evidence as concrete and infallible, while those of the pro-defense bias were more cautious to trust the evidence. The study proved the existence of a pre-trial bias, but never went into specific details on what could actually cause those biases to occur. After reading this study, many questions come up about what the actual cause of these biases are, which is what my study is conducted to figure out. Based on whether a jury member has seen evidence presented in a TV show where the prosecution typically has well-constructed evidence that is infallible, they can take these small mistakes and see them as faulty evidence and make the wrong verdict. Donald Shelton from the University of Michigan dives deeper into the interpretation of the jury by investigating the standard for non-forensic evidence in relation to the trial judge. Shelton conducted a review of 137 exoneration cases and the causes behind the exoneration. He says that the trial jury must preliminarily assess the scientific validity of the testimonies and the underlying reasoning or methodology and determine whether it can properly be applied to the facts at issue. He suggests that it is much more likely to have a pro-prosecution bias because forensic evidence can be very difficult to refute if it's presented in the right way and in the right way to seem leading and concrete. This study shows that jury members are much more likely to think forensic evidence as infallible over any other type of evidence. Therefore, the way that crime television and other sources of crime media portray this evidence may increase a jury member's confidence in a piece of evidence. In a study by Glenda Cooper and Vanessa Materko that investigated the correlation between biases and the verdict studies the effect of a cognitive bias. The two researchers conducted a systematic review of literature on cognitive biases in the forensic science disciplines. They define cognitive bias as a bias, that a broad term that includes a variety of processes that may lead to inaccurate judgments or interpretations. Their studies concluded that there was a clear cognitive bias in the juries. The two studies among fingerprint analysts on the effect of emotional context or seriousness of a crime on suitability decision making provide two differing results. This may be a less important avenue for future research than any other questions, however. This was a connection between fingerprint evidence and the bias of a jury. The focus on fingerprint evidence brought the validity of fingerprint evidence in comparison to television's portrayal of it into question. My research paper used the quantitative analysis of an anonymous survey. The survey was composed of a fictional, abridged version of a court case and a brief questionnaire distributed to a limited respondent pool within the Brophy community. The case presented a series of fingerprints purposely posed to be misleading. The presentation of the evidence was also meant to be ambiguous through the use of an expert witness testifying to the matching of the fingerprints. A cross-examination from the defense was purposely left out of the case to keep the reader biased towards the evidence and the presentation. Respondents were then prompted to answer questions about their general demographics and about their trends in crime media. These questions included information such as race, age, education level, class rigor, and political affiliations. The results obtained from the short questionnaire were quantitatively analyzed using a mix of numerical values and graphs. This methodology was best suited for this study because of the use of the fictional crime case in Smith and Bull's study, while keeping along with the target objective of evaluating crime media's effect on the jury and the verdict. Overall, the percent of respondents who correctly chose the non-guilty verdict was 56.9%. Relatively speaking, this was a very low percentage and raises some concerns. While taking a closer look at responses, it shows that only 62.5% of respondents who clicked yes for the consumption of crime-based media chose the correct verdict, while a smaller 50% of respondents who clicked no chose the correct verdict. Another interesting pattern that emerged was the respondents who said they had hands-on and lecture experience with forensics were incorrect about 80% of the time. This was a surprising factor because when thinking about this, it could be assumed that people who had direct interaction with forensics will correlate to a higher percentage of correct verdict. However, the data shows the opposite trend. People with hands-on experience pick the incorrect verdict more often. Another result that emerged was the majority of respondents were relatively unaware of the process of forensics, with an average response of 2.375 on a 5-point scale when asked about familiarity with forensics. This raises a concern over the level of education around forensic science and its processes. The most obvious and target trend of this survey was the correlation between the choice of verdict and the consumption of crime-based media. The purpose of this paper was to investigate the existence of a pre-trial bias based on crime television and other media in favor of a guilty verdict. It was assumed that the consumption of crime-based media would lead to a higher reliance and bias towards the evidence presented. However, with the data that came through the survey, there was a trend that showed the consumption of crime-based media might actually be correlated to a more correct verdict, as the percentage of consumers of crime-based media and correct verdict submissions were almost the exact same number. Through the fictional court case, even those without forensic knowledge and less consumption of crime-based media could have seen through the presentation of the fingerprint evidence. When presented with the data that came out of the survey, it can be seen that the language in the case study was able to persuade a sizable percentage of respondents. 43% of respondents responded with the incorrect verdict. Exactly half of the respondents, 16 out of 32, who answered that they do not consume crime-based media chose the correct verdict. This shows that having no prior knowledge of the forensic process leads to unsureness and inconsistencies with verdicts. While respondents with prior knowledge and consumption of crime-based media only had a 12.5% higher correct verdicts, this prior knowledge seemed to assist in the jury process. This upward trend in correct verdicts could be due to the familiarity with the terms of forensic science. If a respondent was familiar with these terms, they would be less likely to be swayed by their use of them. With 80% of educated respondents giving the incorrect verdict, it brings awareness to a possible lack of depth in forensic science education. As this research is being conducted, there was much need for education on forensic processes. With the correlation between knowledge of forensic science and the correct verdict, education needs to be put in place. The best process of education needs to be researched and conducted through all levels of study throughout the globe. While crime-based media is not a reliable source of this information, it proved to assist in the process of correctly identifying mismatched fingerprints. In the future, studies should be conducted on the media's specific influence on how jury members interpret the evidence presented. Forensic evidence decides the fate of too many people each year to be out of reach from the general public knowledge and education systems. This is why this education is so important to today.